to have so many good friends at Bradley Hills. Shortly after I came, I actually met Cheryl, who sang in the choir at the time, preceded me in joining. And that reminds me just again to say what Steve said, which is that I'll unfortunately have to leave early. But I'm more than happy to talk with any of you about different experiences that you might have had. By way of background, in terms of my training, I was trained as an MD and in internal medicine, adult medicine. And that followed by a pediatric, as you're thinking about Cheryl here, about in a hematology subspecialty. I was able to also do some research during that time, and that opened an opportunity when we moved here, joining NIH to have both a clinical presence and a laboratory presence. And it really was a privilege to be at NIH. I was delighted to find out that we would be doing clinical consultations in general medicine as well as in hematology. And I did see patients throughout the about 30 years that I was there. The subspecialty got divided even further, and I have a special interest in thrombosis and hemostasis, bleeding and clotting disorders, basically. The interesting thing that came floating to my mind when Steve asked me to talk today was over and over, although there are many, many significant things, the fact that I was so odd and took a major leap of faith, I think, during the time that I was in medical school. It's very, very interesting to find that there was such a revelation. We're all interested in the universe all the way down to our bodies. And as we learn more and more, of course, it's just an amazing thing. And at the time that I was first learning about all the complexity and the many different systems in our bodies, it was a revelation that all of these various systems could work together. And moreover, the amount of knowledge we already had at that time and are still learning today, we have such minute interactions that have to take place and that do take place. We're unaware of that. And I think that this just cries out for much greater presence in our lives, organizing principles and so on. I really believe that this is God at work in all of this, be it centuries that this has taken place over, doesn't matter. There are ways that we are organized that I think just go far beyond the mere chance that this will happen. God is at work in all of this. The other half of the equation, of course, the patients taught me a great deal. There are just so many different instances. In the earlier days, when I was also treating patients with malignant illnesses, the incredible strength of people with faith to be able to face basically the fear of the unknown, I think, is so amazing. Many of the patients would come to me with smiles on their faces, even though they were facing very difficult treatments and also uncertain outcomes. They lived their lives daily with hope and with faith I think of a woman recently that I've talked to. Many of you have had this experience or experienced it yourself, I think, that has had an unusual cancer diagnosis. And there really haven't been enough patients to have proven treatment for it. But she's shouldering on. She just has a wonderful faith that's been carrying her through. She talks of her illness. Of course, I mean, frankly, says that I want to live. I'm doing everything I can. But in addition, her faith has definitely carried her through this far. She said exactly those words to me a few days ago. So I think those are two big lessons and two interesting aspects that I've come away from this profession with. It's just been a privilege to do this work. From isolating DNA in the laboratory to study mutations of patients that I was seeing to treating these same patients. It's an amazing spectrum, amazing picture, and I'm grateful, really grateful for it. Steve?
I wonder, Margaret, you mentioned a couple of patients whose medical problems have been severe, but they got through them with religious faith. Is that a generalization you found?
I think it's very individual. Many patients who have faith, I think, have been much more successful in leading happy lives during the time that they have. That's just become very, very obvious to me.
Okay. Who would like to go next? Brigitte?
So as I told Steve, I don't know how much I, will be able to contribute to this illustrious panel. Many of you know me, I think, we joined Bradley Hills in the early 2000s, but we'd been attending on and off since 1995 because we were members of Capitol Hill Presbyterian Church, and we don't change allegiances easily. But driving back to the Hill for session meetings, and it just got and we liked Bradley Hill, so we were doing both for a number of years, and then we transferred our membership when our son was getting confirmed. So I grew up in Germany. I came here as an exchange student in high school, where I met Dave, and then finished my high school degree in Germany and went to medical school in Germany and did some residency there. And so I'm a pediatrician, retired in 2021 in private practice, which is very different from hospital medicine or working in research and seeing patients. So I see more, those of you who've had children, you know what your pediatrician does or did. And when I retired, it was the last year and a half, almost 2 years. It's really been interesting to look back on those 40 years as a pediatrician, and my overwhelming sense is really that of gratitude. When in Germany at the age of, I was kind of young, I was younger than my cohort. At 18, making the decision to go into medical school and then into pediatrics, how did I know? I didn't. You can sort of construct, why I did what I did, or I can construct that. But in the end, I think I was just very lucky, and to choose a profession that was very gratifying. And what as I told my patients as I was retiring, and I have this box, it was like reading your own eulogy when I, when I retired. It was a privilege, and I think Margaret used that word, to walk with patients, to have them let me into their lives, and to see the resilience of families and children in the daily lives, when the schools called and your kid was kicked out of school, or serious illnesses. Steve asked the question, their faith. I don't know. Well, I think faith is beyond religious affiliation, and sometimes the orthodoxy, I've also found, can really stand in people's way, only accepting a certain kind of religious counseling, or so but I think that that basic tenet that life, with all its complications, is fundamentally good. I think that's what I found. And then, looking back on some of these episodes, as that families had gone through, and then of course, families who live with severe autism and have to put their children into residential care. I mean, just in heart-wrenching decisions that families had to make, and how they got through that. And yes, some families broke up, they got divorced. And so anyway, I think what sustained me during my practice, I've had a few interesting experiences. At Capitol Hill Presbyterian Church, there was one when I was on session. There was like one during Lent. The pastor did not said, we're not going to have any meetings, and we each got a cross. And I think it became for me, so this was many years ago. This was like, what, 25 years, no, more, 30 years ago or something. And I started just doing this, which is somewhat of a centering prayer, stop, look, listen. But just to touch that. And I started doing that before going into a room. And I think I've just never, I don't carry that cross anymore, at least not physically. But it became a habit of, just before I entered that room, to center and just to leave whatever my stuff was, or whatever the nurses had just asked me, or whatever, to leave that outside that room. And it really, sort of that deep listening. And another thing that I read somewhere, way back, was, let a patient talk the first 2 minutes, don't interrupt. It's actually really hard to do when the nurses call you, and there are all these things. But, and I didn't check my watch, but, let people often just, all of us, we want to be heard. And not just our voices, but, what we are trying to say. So I think those were, and then of course, the other thing that really shaped me was my own cancer diagnosis in 2005, 2006. There's nothing like seeing it, and I'm fine. I've been fine, but there's something very fundamental when you are on the other end in a serious illness of the spectrum. and what sustained me both in my own path there and also my professional path is, by that time we were at Bradley Hills, and Margaret Ricks was part of us too, the daybreak meditation. I'm an early riser at 7 a.m. once a week. With Susan Andrews, and that actually drew me to Bradley Hills, and then and then we had a weekly, for a number of years, we had a weekly centering prayer with that Gail was doing. There were usually just 3 or 4 of us. I think it was also at 7 o'clock in the morning or something like that, and so I've just never let these, it wasn't always half an hour that I did my centering prayer, but for, many, many years, I would do a reading on my own in the morning and then sit for 10 or 20 minutes before rushing off to whatever else I was doing in my life to work. So, so that's pretty much it.
I was struck by your comment that you would stop before you went into a patient's room, take a deep breath, and clear your mind and center. Because that's a practice that a lot of us have seen David and Denise do as they get ready for a service or for a Bible study or something like that. Just to clear the mind and get it focused on the task, the other people at hand. Is this a common practice among doctors as well? Is this something they teach you in med school?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't know what other doctors do, but
You may have seen lateral shaking of the head from Cheryl.
I mean, I think way too many people carry their cell phones. I did not, unless there was really something urgent I was expecting. I mean, my family knew the office phone number and, how to get in touch with me. I did not carry my cell phone because I did not want it to buzz. I did not, and all my partners, and it drove me nuts. Just to see that, because anyway, one of my pet peeves, and I didn't make many friends with complaining about it. But I don't know what other people do, but it just helped me. Some people might have a more focused mind to begin with, right? So maybe they don't need it as much, but I did need that, and it was my religious background or my affiliation that helped me. I'm a slow learner, right? So it took many years to learn these. I mean, I started this probably 15 plus years ago. I read Richard. Do some of you know Richard Rohr? Anyway, I read his meditation in the morning, and then I sit, and sometimes just a few minutes, and sometimes longer. So I mean, I've done this for a couple of decades, or I don't know, long time. So it's important, but different people have different needs to be able to do in their professional and personal life, what they need to do, or what they're charged to do.
Yeah, I'm going to take Brigitte off the spotlight here.
Thank you.
So that I can see if there are any hands up or comments that people want to ask before we move on to our next speaker. And I'd like to ask Joni to go next, because Joni has had a medical career that's unlike any other in the world, probably. That it's involved some counseling, some nursing, some church administration, and a whole variety of unique contributions to us here. One of the things that when I served as a deacon, one of the things that I don't know whether it was just starting then or whether it was an initiative of Joni's at that point, was a meditation from the deacons for the deacons each month at their meeting to lead off the meeting. And the duty rotated and got a variety of different kinds of things. So let me find Joni on my screen here. There she is. And pop you up there, Joni.
Hello, good morning. It's good to be
Good
with,
morning in the Midwest.
right. It's good to be with all of you, honestly. Though we moved last April, I haven't looked for another church. My church home happens to be Bradley Hills still, and I'm really grateful for the technology that supports my ability to be with everybody. And as I've told people, even when I'm watching worship, I'm so used to sitting at the back and seeing the back of people's heads that I recognize who's there. Anyway, so I grew up in a family that was not overtly religious. My father was Catholic, my mother was Presbyterian, and I was one of those little children who got dropped off at Sunday school with my sister. And as I used to tell people that would complain about kids getting dropped off at Sunday school at Bradley Hills, my parents loved me enough to take me there. And I think they just hadn't worked out a comfortable relationship with going to worship between the two of them. But it was from my father, who was Catholic, that I remember him talking to me about the fact that it's all the same God. It doesn't matter if you're Muslim, if you're, Jewish, if you're whatever. So consequently, I married a Jew, and and I'm okay with that. And he has been okay with my participation at Bradley Hills. And in fact, when I told him what I'd be talking about this morning, he pointed out some things to me that he thought were important and that were a part of my faith journey. So that was really neat. I do have a Bachelor of Science in Nursing, and I've done a lot of other things. I think the good thing about nursing versus being a doctor, I mean, you have to choose your specialty. In nursing, you can flip around as you need to. So I started off working at the Veterans Hospital. I studied for a year in radiation therapy, which gave me a lot of compassion towards cancer patients. I did public health nursing, which I think that was the best preparation that I had for becoming a parish nurse, honestly. I stopped working for a while to raise children. And then after my husband had a serious illness, I decided that I had better get a Maryland nurse's license, which I hadn't had, but in case I needed to support our family, I, needed a firmer foundation. So then I worked in a pediatrician's office for a while, Brigitte. And then ultimately, Joan Jameson gave me an article about parish nursing, and I pursued that. So I've always felt like God, even as a child, I felt like God wanted me to do something to help people. And I remember a quote that Susan Andrews said one time from the pulpit. It's a Frederick Buechner quote, and it's about how vocation is the place where your deep gladness meets the deep need of someone else. And that's how I have looked at, at my career, honestly. And certainly my career as a parish nurse. I have, I didn't grow up in a family where we did a lot of praying out loud. So that was really hard for me after I became a parish nurse. And I remember Susan telling me not to worry about it, that at some point it would just become clear. And I clearly remember a family at Bradley Hills where the wife had dementia. the son had called on me to come and visit them, and I had visited them all along. I did develop close relationships with families, I feel like, and even extended families who were not, in the Washington area. But anyway, okay, so the wife had dementia. The husband was really ill, and that was why the son had called me to come. And it was obvious to me that he needed to go to the emergency room, so we got him there. And the doctor in the emergency room called the son and I over to say that his father was dying, and it would not be long. He had to stay in the hospital, and it would be a matter of days, if not hours. So we went back to the house to try and talk to the family. And I remember that was the time that it was so clear to me the only thing to do was gather and hold hands and pray together. And that's what we did. We were not even sure if the wife would really understand what was happening, but honestly, by standing there and holding hands and all of us praying together, I felt like she really did. And we sat and talked afterwards, and she really did understand. And that was just such a powerful experience. And I haven't had anything, I felt much more comfortable praying out loud after that, I will say. So when I've had a personal health crisis, more with my husband than myself, I really prefer to be alone. Like if I'm in the hospital waiting room or something, I mean, and that helps me get centered on God and on what I hope the outcome will be. So to sit and make idle, I mean, people always offer, would you like me to come and sit with you? And I have sat with other people, and it's a matter of personal preference, but just mine is I commune with God at that time, and no question about it. As far as other instances of God in my life, this was a friend a parish nurse actually, who was a nun, told me this one, that coincidence is God smiling on you. And every single time that I have gone to the hospital when somebody was in crisis, like in the emergency room, in the ICU, I always found a quick parking space. It was amazing to me. I mean, really, but it had to be a God at work, I mean, what else you get it? Anyway, so that was good. Has Margaret already left?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, that's too bad, because, okay, one of my husband's issues, actually the big issue in 1988, that was undiagnosed at the time, was a clotting disorder. And we ended up at the Mayo Clinic because nobody here sort of was solving the problem. Anyway, but when I came back to the Washington area, what a comfort it was to be able to call on very calm Margaret for just expert advice, and it just meant the world to me, honestly. So, and still does. I mean, I over the years, from time to time, I have called her to ask as things change, and that's really a great comfort. And Bradley Hills and God has provided that for me. So, I would say one of my big events that drew me into parish nursing was Joan Jameson had a group of people who would visit other members, and I don't know if any of you remember Shirley Briggs, but anyway, she was a very eccentric elderly lady when I met her, and I walked quite a journey with her. She had no relatives here. She had one elderly cousin who lived in California, and I can't tell you the whole story, but I ended up with the key to her house. I took her for surgery. I got her to go into a rehab, and that was when I got the key to her house. And ultimately worked with friends of hers to have somebody else take over her power of attorney. And, just it was a full spectrum of helping somebody get through life. And that's kind of what parish nurses do. They just walk alongside other people, and whatever the need is, you try and listen. I was sympathetic to what Brigitte was saying about, people want to talk, and they do. I mean, and they want to speak to somebody that they really trust. And, people from the church, you do tend to trust them more than just, John Q. Public. And also to know that it will be a confidential conversation. I think that's really important to people, to let them share whatever news they want to share with others. So I hope I did that. One of the questions that Steve asked was, had we seen any miracles? I do recall when I was studying radiation therapy, one patient, a cancer patient, who the surgeons had opened him up and said there was not a thing they could do for him. So they sent him for radiation. And after a year or so, they decided, he was still, doing okay. And so the surgeons decided they should open him up again to see what was going on. This was a lot of years ago. Now there would be MRIs or whatever. But anyway, they did, and the cancer was gone. And I kept in touch with that guy for many, many years. We would just send Christmas cards and notes, back and forth to each other. But really talk about a miracle where someone is totally not expected to live. It was really very dramatic for all of us who were involved in his care. And then I don't know if any of you watch NBC, but Al Roker recently was very ill with blood clots. And I heard his wife speaking and saying that he was really a miracle case, and how he had not realized how sick he was. And I think sometimes that's a blessing given to patients by God, that, and in the case of my own husband, he was out of work for 9 months. It was not a small ordeal. And he never knew until after he got well again how ill he had been. And I think, that it's hard on the person watching, harder on the person watching often than it is on the patient going through the ordeal. So I felt like my work with families was as important as my work with, patients, if you will. I don't know what else, what else you might like to know.
You mentioned that Margaret had helped you get through medical crises, thanks to her knowledge and her connection with NIH and so forth. It's always struck me that one of the great unspoken blessings of being part of this community is that we are, I think, the closest church to NIH, which means that we have a disproportionate number of people affiliated with NIH in the congregation.
Right.
And there are not just you, but dozens of people in the congregation who can tell similar stories.
Mm-hmm.
That they've just been talking to somebody that they knew, and they said, "Oh, I know a clinical trial,"
Right.
or "Let me tell you how treatment for this should progress so that you're smarter about what your doctor is talking about." It's amazing.
One of the great connections too is that often Bradley Hills has been contacted with a pastor from a different city or state or whatever, and they will have a parishioner who's either at the Naval Hospital or NIH. And so we will go and visit them. Well, the first time I ever went to what was then Bethesda Naval Hospital, I didn't have any idea where I was going or where the clinical center was. And so, but you get stopped by the guard at the gate, and the guy says, you take the first right. So I did, and I ended up on the helicopter landing pad. Oh my gosh. I mean, that was so scary. So there's this guard running after my car, and I did a quick U-turn and out the, out the.
This is the helicopter landing pad where Marine One lands.
Right. Anyway, so we went out, made the next right, which, did take me to the hospital. But anyway, it was so funny. I had visions of, a story in the Washington Post, parish nurse arrested. Didn't need to do that.
And then, of course, there's the wonderful story that involves us on the fringes of Leon Fleischer and his hand problem. He was being treated in NIH, and when they treated him with Botox and his hand started to relax, first call that he made was to Donald Sutherland. Said, "You've got the closest piano that I know of. Can I come over?" And for the first time in 34 years, he played the piano with two hands.
Wow.
And he dated our piano.
Yeah. Wow. That's so cool.
I would put that in the category of miracles.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Joni. Any other questions for Joni before we move on? We have one more speaker. I've been particularly looking forward to Cheryl because Cheryl was on really the cutting edge of some wonderful medicine through her career. Cheryl Nolte.
For those of you who don't know me, I'm Cheryl Nolte. I've been a member of Bradley Hills since 1979. I take that off. I graduated medical school in 1972. I'm a pediatrician, but also I'm subboarded in a specialty called neonatology, which for those of you who don't know what it is, it's the care of sick infants from the time of birth to however long it takes them to get out of the hospital, which may be a few days to months. Let me start out. Well, I also say that I spent 14 years at Children's Hospital and then 21 years working for the Army Medical Department as a civilian, both at Walter Reed and Bethesda and, in the greater DC area. But to give you a feel for what we did, let me read to you from a chapter I wrote in a book called Hospice Care for Children. And my chapter was entitled Neonatal Death. There are really no expected deaths in the normal newborn nursery. When parents embark on the path of creating a child, they envision a perfect outcome. Anything less is devastating. So for the longest time, I had to deal with that kind of approach to families. Neonatology, if you'll excuse the pun, was very much in its infancy when I started. Those of you who are old enough may recall in 1962, John F. Kennedy's third child died of what was then premature infant lung disease, and no one knew what to do. And anything they tried did not work. So people began to experiment with how to push care that was adult-oriented to the newborn. And the challenge became even more challenging because the majority of children in the neonatal care were premature infants. So we're dealing with not only a small size, but immature unformed organs. that did not necessarily respond well to traditional therapies that were used in older children or adult patients. Making decisions was really quite a challenge because the outcome was really not known. And I'll refer you to a book that has a very appropriate title, and it's called Playing God in the Nursery, written by Jeff Lyon, who this was written back in the 80s, and he actually came to DC and interviewed some of us at Children's Hospital and wrote in a very layman's language what it's like to begin to approach families about making decisions about their children. The problem is that when you're making a decision on initiating care, the thought is, well, why not? Why not start and begin to try? The problem then becomes knowing when it's appropriate to stop or how long to continue care. The difficulty in infants is that the outcomes aren't really known. If you have an adult who is fully functioning and let's say has a stroke, you often know where in the brain the injury is. You can assess what the injury is in physical terms, and then begin to make a reasonable prediction on the prospects of recovery. That's not true in an infant who has yet to show us what their long-term potential is. And it's really even more difficult in a premature infant whose organs, especially the brain, are not even fully formed and may be more susceptible to different kinds of damage. And often we found that the treatments we used were both helpful, but also harmful. The life-saving oxygen that we breathed into these babies' lungs with tubes also produced damage to the lungs, a chronic lung disease known as bronchopulmonary dysplasia. The oxygen we gave and the light we used to help the baby's skin problems with bilirubin and the lung disease caused blindness called retrolental fibroplasia. We produced hemorrhaging in the brain and long-term problems with mental retardation and cerebral palsy along the way with trying to save the infants using those kinds of aggressive therapies. So there was a yin and yang in medicine, but the challenge was to continue going and seeing what new kinds of therapies we could develop that would overcome these problems. There was changes in the nursery that were incredibly fast for the years that I was practicing. I had instances where it was very obvious that the infant was no longer viable. And sometimes it was a challenge to persuade the parents to say, now is the time to stop. I had an infant whose entire bowel was necrosed because of some problems. The infant was supported by artificial life supports, and the family just said, we can't stop. This isn't appropriate. I feel like I'm murdering my child. God would not want it that way. I persuaded them to look at it from a different perspective. It was artificial to use ventilation and tubes and machines to support that child's life. If God means for this child to survive, this child has to show that he could do it on his own. And we're able to very gently discontinue the life supports, and the parents were able to hold their child for the first time and allow the child to die a more peaceful death. And they felt, yes, that was God's will. On the other hand, you always try to make a decision together with the family. This was, the patients were not only, of course, the infant, as Brigitte knows, but the parents that were involved. And sometimes the parents' decisions were not always in line with what I thought was good medical practice. One anecdote was that I had a patient whose father was the chief of staff of George H.W. Bush when he was the vice president. So this was back in the early 80s. And I never met the wife, which was always problematic when talking to family about what the wishes were for the child. This child had some findings on a CT scan in the brain that over time we knew were ominous findings. But sometimes our technology preceded our understanding and ability to interpret what it meant. So we knew that these findings were not normal, but I wasn't comfortable enough to say this is a lethal problem and it will lead to certain kinds of long-term problems. So in sitting and talking to the father, I had to lay this out for him. He said, my wife couldn't take having a handicapped child. I don't want a handicapped child. And with kind of the weight of his office behind him, he looked at me and said, I don't want to continue. I would like to discontinue the life support on this baby. I do not want a handicapped child. And this presents quite a dilemma. I've been in the position of wanting to continue life support and families wanting to discontinue life support and families do not. But this was kind of an interesting twist in fate. I had to tell him that we needed to take under consideration that we really didn't know what the long-term outcome was, that this was we felt that we needed to continue. Make a long story short, I think God really intervened in this case because the infant died in spite of what we were doing. And in some ways, it was a blessing as well, because the father allowed an autopsy and we were able to correlate the findings we had in the brain with the CT scan findings and begin to put pieces of information together to help us be able to predict better for parents in the future. So maybe that was a blessing in disguise. I don't know. There were always joyous parts in the nursery. We did have miracle babies. At some point back in the 80s, there was a well-known neonatologist who wrote an article saying how small is too small and how far should we push the envelope on trying to save some of these preterm infants. Because in the early days, 1,500 grams, which is about 1,000, what's 1,500 grams? About
By
a
300
pound,
pounds.
a couple pounds was small. Then we started going to 1,000 grams, then 500 grams, very, very small infants. In fact, I had a pediatric cardiologist come into the nursery at Walter Reed and in the middle of the night to consult on a baby. And he took a look at that child and I'm sorry, this is medical humor. He says, the piece of beef I had for dinner last night was larger than this infant. They were that tiny. But the point being, we were pushing the edge, and the smaller the infant, the higher probability of long-term problems. But I had the joy of running the long-term follow-up clinic, the high-risk follow-up clinic, to be able to do neurodevelopmental assessments on infants who had been in our nursery, to look at what they were like and to correlate it again back to what their problems were. And of course, with children, as Brigitte knows, you have to wait a long time before you really know what their true outcome is, well beyond the first couple of years of life. But it was rewarding to see how well many of these infants did. In fact, I don't know if those of you who remember Ginny Campbell, Ginny and Sandy Campbell, who belonged to this church. I took care of their son, Stephen, in the nursery at Children's. And I recently reconnected with Ginny in Williamsburg. And of course, Stephen is in his 40s and a very successful businessman and has his own family. And the other really joyous story that really made my Christmas, I took care of a Jeffrey Barham in the nursery at Children's. And his mother was a very religious woman, was extremely grateful for what I did, and proceeded to send me a Christmas card with a Christmas letter in it every single year since 1982. And she would include a picture of the little boy, the classic tiny school pictures, and pictures of him with the family as he grew up, and anecdotes about what Jeffrey was doing, how he grew up to be a football player in high school, went to college, became a school principal, coached football, and I came to learn that he lives in Loudoun County. Well, my daughter, Stephanie, lives in Leesburg. And I went to my granddaughter's Abby's holiday concert at school several weeks ago. And guess who I saw there?
Oh, no.
Oh, wow.
I saw Jeffrey Barham with his wife, who is on a committee, a PTA committee with my daughter Stephanie, and their little girl is in my granddaughter Abby's class at school.
Oh, wow.
So you talk about a wonderful feeling. I actually had run into Jeffrey once before, about 6 years ago, but at a similar event out in Leesburg. But this was just sort of the pièce de résistance of a long-term career, especially seeing that God does work in wonderful ways.
Wow.
Wow.
You talk about a huge part of your practice is care for the parents. What about care for siblings, older siblings, and how they come to grips with this? Did you have any experience with that?
Not directly. Often these were parents with either small children and you really didn't get to meet the children. They weren't allowed to come into the nursery, particularly back in those days. But I became very involved. And again, back through this hospice care for children, I became chairman of the board of an organization called I'm having a brain cramp. It was an organization that looked at palliative care for children and getting children from the Coordinating Center for Home and Community Care, or now called the Coordinating Center. And in the early days, you were not able to send children home with technology. And in fact, some of the, I'm getting to your point, it's a little circuitous, but back in the day, if a child was still dependent on oxygen or a ventilator, there was no place to send them. You kept them in the hospital or you had to institutionalize them somewhere. And this particular organization was very much involved in helping the families move these children from facilities into the home and providing support for these families in the home. Insurance companies did not want to pay for nursing full-time. A child on a little bit of oxygen was not considered problematic, but it was for the child and for the family. And one of the things this organization did was to not only look at how to take care of the medical aspects of having a child with challenging issues in the home, but to look at the entire spectrum of what that family was going through. So they would look at not only the medical needs, but the educational needs, the psychosocial needs of the child and the family, the other siblings, the educational needs, the financial needs, the religious needs, and try to build an entire package of coordinated care for the family with, for a child that had life-threatening illnesses. And this is a concept that I feel passionate about in today's world, that modern medicine, and whether it's children or adults, really doesn't take into account. I'm on a little bit of a soapbox, but you know, when I look at what hospitals do, and I went through this with Walter when he had a major heart attack, they really don't help you orient back into the community and really pay attention to all the needs that you're going through, even down to the basics of coordinating multiple specialists who have to talk to one another to know what's going on. And this was especially true in a lot of these babies that we sent home. I would often serve as the kind of the linchpin for getting the pediatrician and the pulmonologist and the physical therapist and the educator to talk to one another to create a universal package of coordinated care.
Sounds like a hospitalist role.
Hospitalists take care of you in the hospital. This is a care coordinator
Care
role,
coordinator,
and
which
it's a position that is not
Yeah.
funded.
I know,
But
it's
it's a linchpin, and
Absolutely.
it doesn't have, it should not be the physician. So anyway, sorry, I got on a little bit of a soapbox, but I feel very strongly and see it over and over again. Yeah.
It's like a form of medical social work.
Yeah.
In effect, it
And a
is.
manager.
It's a
Yeah,
manager.
care manager.
Yeah, it really
Or
is.
parish nurse.
Yeah,
Definitely.
Who was that?
that was Joni agreeing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that Joni actually played a lot of a role like that for us.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was huge.
But she couldn't work directly with the doctor.
I know, I know.
Michael looks like he has a question.
Michael has a question. We have time for exactly one question, I think.
I'll
Entirely
make this-
predictable with this group.
I'll make this really, really quick. It was a wonderful presentation. I enjoyed it immensely. I'm in Dallas right now. I just wanted to say that one thing that really struck me about every single speaker today was the importance of listening, and how much that should inform all of us in how we're going to, how we should proceed in our relations with other people, and how we should use our faith. And that is that if we tell people what we think is right, we're going to get a lot less accomplished than if we listen to what's going on with them before we reply. And it may seem really simple, but it's very hard to do. Those of us that are sort of type A personalities want to jump right in and fix it and tell them what the answer is, and that's it. And that's exactly what we should not be doing.
Yeah,
So
and
that was all I was gonna
immediately to my
say.
right is the professor of listening.
Can I jump in and say that the current president of the International Listening Association is in India, and he teaches in a medical school an entire course in listening for all of the students in that particular medical school. And it's fantastic. So yes, Michael, thank you.
All right, we are, with this group of experts predictably running over time. I thank all four of you. This has been hugely interesting, informative, and inspirational, and a great way to kick off this series of discussions of journeys. It's been really, really good. Next week, you'll have to watch the Tuesday church email, because the speaker that we had scheduled, travel plans changed and they can't speak. And the backup that we had, travel plans changed and can't speak. So I'm contacting a third person right now and keeping my fingers crossed. So I am hoping we'll have a session next week. If this person can't make it and needs to come later, we just will have to forego adult ed for a week. Not what we like, not what we like, especially at the beginning of a wonderful series to start off a new year about faith and hope. But may become necessary given how busy and complex the lives of all of our volunteer participants are. And one other quick note, this is an audience that is very committed to what we as an adult ed lay ministry are doing. We are dependent on you. You are our bosses, and we try to respond to what you want. A number of us will be leaving the lay ministry over the course of the next year, and we are actively looking for people to come in. It's a wonderful group of people to work with. They're creative. They listen well. I'm simply the public face of a really creative, strong team that I enjoy working with immensely. So if anyone has an interest in helping keep these programs going into the future, please reach out and contact one of us. Carol Starr is here in the room with me. Michael, who's still got his hand raised up on the screen, is a member of the group. Jack Bennett is a member of the group. Louise Meyer is a member of the group. So please reach out to us and learn more about what adult ed does, and we will be happy to talk to you. Thank you all for attending. Watch your bulletin on Tuesday for news. Well, we'll definitely have the answer by Tuesday as to whether or not we'll have adult ed. But thank you all, and we'll see you, we hope, next week.
Okay.
And thanks all to our speakers.
Bye.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Oh, thank you, Cheryl. That
You're
was so
welcome.
powerful.
Yeah.